A janitor's daughter uncovers a billion-dollar betrayal buried in fine print, just moments before a powerful CEO signs away his entire empire to the woman he trusts most. What she does next changes everything. Lies unravel, secrets surface, and one young woman becomes the storm no one saw coming. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories that prove the smallest voice can echo the loudest. I was just supposed to wipe the glass doors. That morning, Imani Reed, the janitor's daughter, the invisible girl in black sneakers, stepped onto the 45th floor of Hargrave Tower like she had 100 times before. I had my rag in one back pocket, a spray bottle clipped to my belt, and a mental checklist of floors, mirrors, and coffee rings to erase before noon. That's all I came for. Not a war, not a legacy. The boardroom was glass-walled, sunlight bleeding through the east side, throwing long gold shadows across the table. 12 leather chairs. One empty. At the head of it all sat Charles Hargrave, tall, white-haired, the billionaire face behind the empire. He was dressed down in a pressed gray shirt and silk tie. But even from where I stood, just outside the door with my mop cart, I could see his hand was trembling slightly above the page in front of him. The pen hovered mid-air, like it was waiting for permission from something deeper than logic. Or maybe just habit. Across from him, Veronica Wells, his wife, was already smiling. A slim woman in a navy suit with cheekbones like geometry and a voice that could slice a courtroom clean. She sat perfectly still, but something in the corner of her lip twitched with each passing second. The entire room, attorneys, executives, assistants, held its collective breath. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this moment. I shouldn't have been able to read the paper on the desk from where I stood. But I had. And I knew what that clause meant. He was about to sign everything away. I stepped through the threshold before I could stop myself. "Sir," I said, not too loud. Just enough to ripple the room. "Don't sign that." Time froze. Like literally. A second ago, someone had been shifting their weight near the corner chair. Now they were stone. Charles blinked. The pen didn't move. The entire room turned toward me like I detonated something. Veronica was the first to speak. "Excuse me?" Her voice was soft but lined with ice. I stepped further in, heart jackhammering beneath my hoodie. "I read the clause," I said, holding up the folded paper I'd kept in my pocket for over a day now, like it might protect me. "Section 7, subsection C, line 5. The one with irrevocable delegation of fiduciary authority." I paused, gauging the room. "If you sign it, she gains complete control of Hargrave Holdings. No oversight, no sunset clause. It doesn't delegate, it surrenders." Charles lowered the pen slowly. A few of the executives shot glances at each other. One of the legal guys, a silver-haired man with a Harvard ring and too much confidence, snatched his own copy and flipped pages. The rustling sounded loud against the stunned silence. "She's the janitor's kid," Veronica said with a tiny laugh. "This is outrageous. Charles, please." But her voice wasn't velvet anymore. It had edges. The lawyer's brows furrowed. "She's not wrong," someone muttered from the far end. "A junior staffer, I think." "There's no co-signature language. That clause doesn't belong in a power of attorney document." Charles turned his eyes to me. For the first time in my life, a man who owned private jets and island retreats looked directly at a girl who cleaned smudges off conference tables. "How did you even know to look at that?" he asked. I swallowed. "My grandfather was a legal clerk," I said. "After he passed, I kept his books. I read contracts instead of comic books growing up." Veronica's composure frayed. "And what were you doing with that document?" she snapped. "That's confidential." "It was left in the copier," I said. "I didn't steal it. I just read it, and once I read it, I couldn't ignore it." She turned to security. "Escort her out." The guard stepped forward. I didn't flinch. I stood there, fingers trembling behind my back. Paper clutched so tightly the crease was cutting into my palm. "Wait," Charles said. His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. He looked at Veronica again. "Why didn't legal flag this?" "It's boilerplate," she replied too fast. "Standard language." "It's not," I said, my voice louder now. "It's custom drafted. It references a dormant Delaware holding company. I looked it up." That cracked the room open. One of the lawyers stopped pretending to skim and stared. Someone else pulled out a tablet. The security guard stepped back like he was no longer sure whose orders mattered. Veronica tried again, quieter. This is absurd. She shouldn't even be in this room. I know, I said. I'm not supposed to be here. People like me don't belong in boardrooms. But I also know if he signs that paper, you'll bury this company in red tape. And in 10 years, no one will remember how it started, just that it happened on his watch. I turned, ready to leave. My ears were ringing. My chest felt like it might collapse. I'd said too much, too loud, in the wrong room. Then his voice rang out behind me. Just one word. Wait. I stopped mid-step, turned my head, our eyes met, and in that flicker of a moment, he didn't see the janitor's daughter anymore. He saw the one person in that room who told the truth. His pen never touched the page. I walked out through the glass doors, into the hallway that had always felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the building. My hands were sweating. My heart was in free fall. I had no plan beyond that moment. I didn't know what I had started. All I knew was something was wrong. And I had said it. And sometimes that's where everything begins. Outside, the sky was bleeding rain. Not the kind that politely taps your shoulders, but the kind that soaks you to the bone before you hit the sidewalk. I pulled up my hoodie and kept walking down Lexington, past the bakery where the security guys always grabbed bagels, past the dry cleaner with the cracked window. I didn't run. I didn't look back. But I knew something had just shifted. Not in the company. In me. It started with a copier and a gut feeling. The night before I interrupted that boardroom, I was just another shadow on the 45th floor. Sleeves rolled, headphones tucked into one ear, wiping down the executive kitchenette while the office lights buzzed in half-sleep. My mom was cleaning 2 floors below, and I had maybe 30 minutes before our next round of elevator polishing. That was when I heard it, the copier down the hall, humming like it was finishing someone's last-minute rush print, but no one was there. I almost didn't check. Almost. I don't go around snooping. I was raised better than that. But that night, the floor was too quiet, and I'd learned to trust the silence, especially when it felt unnatural. So I walked over and found a thick packet lying on the tray. Crisp pages. Title page up. Final authority transfer. Hargrave Holdings. Something about the way the words were stacked made my stomach clench. I didn't pick it up at first. I just stared. Delegation of authority was bolded 3 times on the cover, and underneath I saw 2 names, Veronica Wells and Charles Hargrave. Now, maybe to most people that doesn't mean anything. A wife and husband shifting legal roles? Sure. Looks innocent. But I'd spent half my childhood curled up next to my grandfather's feet while he read penciled contracts for local tenants and veterans who couldn't afford real lawyers. He used to read clauses out loud and explain why some words cost people homes or freedom. When I was 10, I could already tell you the difference between may and shall. I didn't grow up on fairy tales. I grew up on footnotes. So when I saw unrestricted delegation underlined near the bottom margin, my pulse did a strange thing. I picked it up. I shouldn't have. I know. I should have walked away, pretended it wasn't my business, tossed it into the executive outbox and finished my shift. But I didn't. I took that file and slipped it into my hoodie, heart pounding the entire time. I couldn't explain why, only that it felt off, like holding a gun with no safety. That night, at home, I spread the papers across our kitchen table. We live above a laundromat in Queens. Our place always smells like dryer sheets and the faint echo of someone else's detergent. My mom was asleep already, her shoes by the door. I made a pot of tea and sat down in the glow of the fridge bulb, flipping through each page like I was back in high school, cramming for finals. At first, it looked technical, legal jargon, cross-references, appendix tables. But then I saw it, Section 7, Sub C, Line 5. The clause was slick, almost too slick. One of those lines that hides itself by sounding formal. Grants irrevocable decision-making power to the named party over all trust, proxy, and holding assets under applicable discretion. But there was no expiration, no cosigner, no third-party review or oversight trigger. That wasn't a delegation, that was a handover. And if Charles Hargrave signed it, he wouldn't just be giving Veronica a pen, he'd be handing her the vault key to his company's soul. I leaned back, heart thudding. The radiator hissed behind me. I remember staring at our fridge for a full minute, like it might have something to say. Then I reached for the stack of books my grandfather had left behind, his old legal dictionary, some annotated landlord-tenant casebook, a binder full of margin notes. I kept them even after he passed. Couldn't bring myself to throw them out. That night, they felt like the only thing standing between me and a very real storm. I read the clause again, then again. The second time I noticed something else, an obscure reference to an entity named Selena Trust Holdings, DE. Delaware shell companies are a trick as old as time. You register a legal entity, bury it in footnotes, and use it as a pass-through for other moves. Only thing was, Selena had no listed purpose. No address, just a name on a piece of paper that hadn't been touched in over a year. My hands were shaking now. I stayed up until 3 in the morning. By the 5th read-through, I'd found 3 more signals. The removal of standard fiduciary checks, a line that allowed for asset consolidation in the interest of strategic acceleration, and, buried in the last appendix, a clause that allowed the signatory to redirect voting power in dormant investor accounts. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to be complicit in silence. I wasn't supposed to have that document. I wasn't supposed to read it. But if I didn't say anything and Charles signed that paper, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I let someone walk into a trap with both eyes shut. That he lost everything because I chose not to speak. And here's the thing they never tell you about moments like that. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall into it. You trip over your own fear, your own voice, and before you realize it, you've said the one thing that can't be unsaid. That's why I spoke up. Because I knew. Because the moment I understood what Veronica had written, I wasn't a janitor's daughter anymore. I was a witness, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. When the sun came up, the sky over Queens was flat gray. I made toast, burned it, barely ate it. I tucked the folded clause into my pocket like it was a confession I hadn't asked for. I told my mom I'd be working overtime that day. I didn't say why. And I rode the train into the city, still unsure what I was going to do. I just knew that if Charles Hargrave picked up that pen, everything might disappear. And I might be the only one who saw it coming. ChatGPT Hanoi. The message came at 6:42 p.m., just as I stepped off the subway into the cool, grimy hush of Greenpoint. You saw it too. That was all it said. No name. No number I recognized. Just those 4 words sitting there on my cracked phone screen, like someone had plucked them straight out of my brain. I stood frozen under the flickering station light, the whoosh of the departing train fading behind me. My thumb hovered above the screen, then typed before I could stop it. Who is this? The reply came in seconds. Someone who tried to stop it before. Old Greenpoint Library, 8:30. Come alone. I stared at the words, heart crawling into my throat. The old Greenpoint Library had been boarded up for 5 years, since the city cut funding and sold the building off to some shell foundation that never did anything with it. The thought of meeting anyone there, especially someone who somehow knew, screamed every warning bell I'd been raised to obey. Don't go alone, don't follow unknown numbers, and definitely don't chase ghosts into abandoned buildings. But something deeper inside me stirred. Not recklessness, not even curiosity. It was duty. Call it instinct, call it legacy. My grandfather used to say, if a trail finds you, it's because you were meant to walk it. So at 8:15, I stood beneath the crumbling limestone archway of the library, rain dripping from my hood, clutching the folded clause tighter than ever. The front gate groaned open like it hadn't been touched in months. Inside, it was hollow and silent, save for the echo of my own breath. Moonlight streamed through a broken stained glass window. Dust hung in the air like memory. He stood by a pillar, tall, coat frayed at the cuffs, salt and pepper hair cropped close, like he hadn't had a haircut in months but still cared about keeping clean edges. His presence didn't radiate danger. It radiated exhaustion. A kind of quiet resignation, like someone who used to matter in a room and then was told to leave the table. You're Imani, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer right away. My eyes flicked to the shadows, the exits, the way his hand stayed visible. No sudden movements, no threat, just a worn envelope in his fingers. And you are? I finally asked. He stepped forward slowly. Gregory Monroe. I used to be head of internal compliance at Hargrave Holdings. Used to be. I didn't shake his hand. I just looked at him and said what mattered. How did you find me? You made a ripple today, he said. Bigger than you think. The boardroom has cameras. Not all of them are corporate. I shifted, unsettled. Is this place wired too? He smiled, dry, not unkind. Just mold and ghosts. He handed me the envelope. I took it reluctantly and cracked it open. Inside, document scans, bank ledgers, notarized pages, shell company registrations, wire transfer records. The first one I read had Veronica's name attached to a proxy entity called Raven Edge Solutions. The second was a wire trail to Zurich. The third linked to a Cayman firm with Hargrave Holdings Subtrust labeled in the memo. I didn't need to understand it all to feel it. This was deeper than a bad clause. It was a blueprint for dismantling a kingdom, quietly, legally, and with enough layers to shield every motive. I don't get it, I whispered, flipping through. Why all this? Isn't being married to him enough? Gregory's eyes darkened. Because wives can be removed from wills, legal proxies can't. The truth hit like ice in my veins. She's not just trying to control the company, I murmured. She's setting up a whole alternate infrastructure underneath it, a second skeleton. Gregory nodded. She's been doing it for years. Embedded clauses, dormant shells, offshore pass-throughs, each one a step closer to full control. I closed the folder, my hands cold despite the heat rising in my chest. Why me? I asked. Why now? Because you weren't supposed to see it, he said. And you did. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean I don't have anything to lose. He studied me, gaze suddenly sharper than before. Then think carefully. If you go down this road, there's no halfway point, no returning to normal. I looked down at the file again. Names, figures, paper trails disguised as nothing. And somewhere in the middle of it, Charles's signature, real on some pages, forged on others. His legacy being unspooled by someone sleeping beside him. Will he believe me? I asked. Gregory hesitated. No, not at first, but he might believe himself if you push him to look. I exhaled slowly. The folder felt heavier than paper now. It felt like fire, like risk. I need to get home, I said. He nodded. You have my number. Be careful. I started to walk, but he called out one more time. And Imani, he said, don't trust elevators. Always take the stairs. That night, the streets glistened under sodium light. My breath fogged in the air as I crossed back toward the train station, the envelope pressed to my chest under my coat. The city didn't see me, just another girl in a hoodie, walking like she belonged to the shadows. But I knew something the skyscrapers didn't. Sometimes the tallest buildings fall, not from fire, not from bombs, not from lawsuits, but from a clause no one thought you'd read. The USB drive burned a hole in my pocket the whole subway ride to Chinatown. I sat near the back of the train, hood up, headphones in, with no music playing, just the sound of the city rumbling around me like a living thing. I kept one hand on the file Gregory had given me and the other on that black stick of plastic and secrets. My reflection in the window stared back, older than it should have looked. My face wasn't scared, just awake, like I'd crossed some invisible threshold and couldn't go back. Victoria Chang was waiting at a table in the back room of a Vietnamese cafe. She didn't look like the kind of lawyer Hargrave Holdings usually kept around. No flashy jewelry, no leather briefcase, no bright smile. She wore a dark blazer, her hair pulled back tight, no makeup, and a stare that could cut through a confession in under 5 seconds. You brought it? She asked before I even sat down. I nodded and pulled out the drive like it was radioactive. She took it with steady fingers, popped it into her laptop, and leaned over the screen as lines of data started to unfold. Her brows didn't furrow, they climbed. By the third folder, she was muttering under her breath. Gregory wasn't bluffing, she said, voice low. What do you see? She tilted the screen toward me. Internal signatures, transfer patterns, Cayman, Zurich, BVI. Here, look at this. She opened a window, then another. Cross-referenced merger documents against offshore filings. I didn't know how her fingers moved so fast, but I understood what she was showing me. Clara, no Veronica, had been engineering this for years. Set up dummy firms, push through mergers, embed legal authority deep inside corporate paperwork that looked routine. Then use that embedded authority to redirect liability, reroute money, and gradually strip Charles of control without him even realizing it. She wasn't stealing the company in one strike. She was hollowing it out like termites through floorboards. Why didn't the lawyers catch this? I asked. Victoria stopped typing. Her expression was flat, but her eyes told me everything. Because they weren't meant to, she said. You hide something deep enough, long enough, and surround it with enough technical fog, and no one questions it. Especially when it's coming from someone who looks like Veronica. I sat back in the wooden chair, the grain biting into my shoulder blades. So this isn't about a power of attorney, I murmured. It's about building a back door. Victoria nodded. And you found the first real crack in the marble. Outside, a garbage truck clanked over a pothole. Inside, I felt like the air had stopped moving. I didn't even want to get involved, I said quietly. I just couldn't unread what I saw. Victoria looked at me for a long second. What do you want, Imani? Protection? Credit? A settlement? I shook my head. I wanted to stop it. For a moment, she said nothing, just sat with it. Let it settle in the air. You may have just handed me the case of my career, she said, but it's also the most dangerous one I've ever touched. You're not just threatening a woman's ambition. You're pulling the curtain off an entire machine. Then we'd better pull hard, I said before I could talk myself out of it. That night, I sat cross-legged on the living room floor of our apartment. My mom was already asleep in the recliner, her hand resting on a folded dish towel like she'd nodded off mid-fold. The TV played some late-night sitcom rerun, laugh track echoing like it belonged to another world. I opened my laptop. Victoria had sent me a compressed folder of the files she was preparing for the Department of Justice. Inside were signatures, audio files, email threads, each one more damning than the last. Then one name jumped out. C. Wells. Proxy authorization, Vance merge. I clicked. The document opened, 6 months old, transferring discretionary voting power over Charles Hargrave's personal investment fund to Veronica, with a matching signature from Howard Vance. It was his name I hadn't seen until now. Howard Vance. Former Deputy General Counsel, one of Charles's oldest legal advisors, the man who trained half the board's legal staff, the man everyone trusted. And there he was, co-signing a document that effectively gave Veronica the keys to Charles's financial empire. My stomach turned. Then a new message popped up. Unknown number. You're being watched. I froze. The next message followed instantly. Look under Ravencross transfers, week of May 4th. Clara didn't just funnel cash, she funneled people. My hands moved before fear could stop them. I dug into the spreadsheet, opened the May 4th ledger, scrolled to line 17. Wire transfer. MS Holdings, $720,000. Consulting package. Intake file clearance ID, G. Monroe Gregory. I slammed the laptop shut. They hadn't just fired him. They'd paid someone to erase him, to disappear him, to make sure his warnings never saw the light of day. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would wake my mom. He was right. This wasn't just money. This was a system. Across the city, somewhere in a suite I'd never stepped foot in, Veronica probably still believed I was just a scared girl with a guilty conscience and a loud mouth. But she was wrong. Because I wasn't scared anymore. I was armed. The call came just after dawn, when Manhattan still wore its pale blue hush, and the laundromat downstairs hadn't yet rattled to life. My phone lit up with a number I didn't know, but the voice was unmistakable. Deep, gravelly, a little frayed around the edges. Imani, it's Charles Hargrave. I need you to see something. Now. He gave no room for questions, just an address and a floor. The private suite, atop Hargrave Tower, 47 stories above the sidewalks I'd spent years scrubbing. I threw on the first clean hoodie I could find, kissed Mom's forehead, and hurried for the first uptown train, pulse banging like sneakers in a dryer. Security usually ignored me. Today they treated me like a hand-delivered subpoena. A junior guard escorted me through a maze of glass corridors and whispered, almost reverently, "Good luck," before key-carding the penthouse door. I stepped into a room that looked like a silent hurricane had swept through. Contracts fanned across Persian rugs, red ink annotations glowing under desk lamps, bankers' boxes stacked like ramparts. Charles stood in the middle, sleeves rolled, silver hair rumpled, thumb swiping back and forth on a tablet that kept spitting out fresh alarms. He didn't greet me with small talk. He just handed me a pair of noise-canceling headphones and tapped play on an audio file he'd dredged from the company servers. I listened. Veronica's voice. "It'll be easy, Howard. He trusts me when he's tired." A male reply. "Vance, calm as a snake. Then we move the assets before he smells smoke." Every sentence felt like splinters under my skin. Charles set the headphones aside and looked at me. Really looked, as if the last 24 hours had burned off every layer of corporate polish and left only raw bone. You were right, he said, voice low. I was signing away my own lungs. He motioned to the scattered pages. Every delegation Veronica drafted in the last 18 months. Same pattern, different disguise. I let her slip them through because I thought delegation meant trust. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to apologize for seeing what I'd seen. Instead, I squared my shoulders. Then let's stop her before the next signature finishes the job. We spent the next 2 hours knee-deep in paper. He had 2 legal aides pulling dockets, another cross-checking offshore registries, a young tech scraping metadata from scanned PDFs. I marked every clause that mirrored the one I'd exposed, my grandfather's old pen gliding like it remembered the duty. Sunlight crawled across the glass walls, turning the room into a greenhouse of uncomfortable truths. But we kept working, fueled by bitter coffee and the knowledge that paper, when weaponized, can be deadlier than any gun. At 10:30, the elevator dinged. The air sucked itself quiet. Veronica stepped out in a powder blue sheath dress, hair pinned, smile lacquered on, but her eyes darted over the battlefield of documents, and I saw the first flicker of unease. She glided forward, heels tapping like a metronome. Charles, what is all this melodrama? You canceled the foundation luncheon. He didn't raise his voice. Tell me again why Section 7 needed to remove the Oversight Committee. Veronica's lashes didn't flutter. Streamlining approvals, you said yourself you were overwhelmed. Charles lifted a sheet smeared with highlighter. This isn't streamlining. It's stripping the locks from every door I ever installed. Her gaze landed on me, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Why is she in my husband's office? Charles cut in before I could answer. She's the reason I'm still your husband, Veronica. For the first time since I'd met her, Veronica's composure cracked, just a fractional twitch at the corner of her mouth. She collected herself fast, turning every syllable into a dagger. You're letting a girl with a mop pail rewrite our marriage. I felt the insult like a slap, but Charles surprised me. No, he said, I'm letting facts do that. He tapped the tablet. The damning recording spilled into the room. Veronica's own voice filled the suite, cool and unmistakable. She didn't flinch, but the skin around her eyes tightened. When the file ended, silence throbbed. She tried a different weapon, pity, softer now. Charles, we built this empire together. You know how cutthroat the board is. I protected us. He folded his arms. You protected yourself. Her tone iced over. You're tired, darling. This girl is manipulating you for a payout. I opened my mouth, but Charles held up a hand. Enough. Then, almost gently, he said, I loved the woman who challenged me, Veronica, not the one who forged my future. Her lips parted, then sealed. A muscle flickered in her jaw. I sensed something feral rising behind her eyes, cornered ambition. And then she looked at me, steady and lethal. You should remember where you came from, Imani. Big towers have long shadows. Charles stepped forward, blocking the glare. Threaten her again and see how quickly those shadows turn into subpoenas. The moment stretched like pulled wire. Finally, Veronica lifted her chin, smoothed her dress, and pivoted toward the elevator. You'll regret this panic, she whispered as the doors slid shut. I didn't breathe until the panel light winked out. Charles exhaled, rubbed his temples, and sank onto the edge of the desk. She won't stop, he said. She'll weaponize every ally I didn't realize was hers. I sat opposite him, adrenaline crashing into fatigue. Then we move faster. We have Victoria. We have Gregory's files. We have your signature still yours. One of the aides poked her head in. Sir, compliance is ready to lock down internal authorizations. They need your biometric confirm. Charles nodded. Do it. Nobody moves a dime until this audit is done. While he handled logistics, I stepped to the window. 47 stories up, the city looked like a blueprint, impossible to crack, yet in my backpack lay a USB that could topple half the blocks below. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, nice view, shame if it shattered. My breath hitched. Before fear could plant itself, I showed the screen to Charles. He read it, jaw hardening. Vance, he muttered. He called security, ordered protective detail for my mother within the hour. I wanted to object, Mom hated fuss. But the thought of that message reaching her first chilled me silent. By late afternoon, the suite resembled a war room. Whiteboards filled with flowcharts, walls taped with flow of funds maps, red string tracing shell companies. Victoria arrived in sensible flats, carrying a binder thicker than a law school textbook. She shook my hand like we were equals, then told Charles the DOJ was very interested. Translation: subpoenas were days, maybe hours away. She scanned the room, nodded approvingly, and said, "Mr. Hargrave, you just became the whistleblower on your own company. Congratulations. Uncomfortable, but strategically brilliant." Evening painted the skyline salmon and gold. We paused only for takeout noodles, eaten straight from cartons over stacks of notarized exhibits. At some point, Charles slipped out, returning with a small velvet box. He pressed it into my hand. Inside lay a brushed steel keycard embossed with the company crest and my name beneath. Amani Reed, Special Counsel Aide. "I don't want charity," I whispered. "It isn't," he said. "It's armor." Night settled thick and humming. Around 9, the glass wall behind us reflected the room like a mirror. A billionaire hunched over evidence of his own near ruin. A young woman once invisible now drawing red circles around betrayal. And a lawyer stitching every scrap into a net tight enough to catch giants. I thought of Veronica somewhere in the city, plotting her countermove, and felt fear pulsing at the edges of my resolve. But fear, I'd learned, is just untapped momentum. I slid the keycard into my wallet. "Tomorrow," Victoria said, closing her binder with a decisive snap, "we alert the board and file emergency injunctions. If Veronica tries to move assets overnight, federal marshals will be watching." Charles offered me a tired, genuine smile. "You should get some sleep, Amani." I shook my head. "I've spent enough nights asleep while power rewrote the rules. I'll stay." Sometime after midnight, while printers hummed and the city's lights blinked like restless stars, I stood alone at the window again. My reflection merged with the skyline. A girl and a city, both learning that silence can be more dangerous than noise. I thought about Grandpa's voice reading contracts in the dim glow of our old duplex, about Mom's steady hands folding towels, about how floors gleam only because someone kneels to polish them. I pressed a fingertip to the glass. Veronica was right about one thing. Towers have long shadows. But she forgot the simplest principle of physics. Shine enough light and even the tallest shadow retreats. Behind me, the printer stopped. Outside, dawn was an hour away. And somewhere in that fragile hour, between night's last secret and morning's first promise, I realized the next signature in this story would not be forged. It would be mine. Courtroom 14C smelled like wood polish and tension. The benches creaked under the weight of reporters, attorneys, and board members who looked like they hadn't slept since the story broke. Suits rustled, eyes darted, and in the middle of it all, I sat in a navy sweater that still smelled like the back closet of the dry cleaners where Mom worked. My fingers were folded tight in my lap, my shoulders square, my breath calm only because I told it to be. To my left sat Victoria Chang, cool and composed in a charcoal suit, flipping through her notes like this was just another Monday. To my right, my mother Denise held my hand in both of hers, her grip small but immovable. And across the aisle, flanked by legal sharks and defiance, sat Veronica Wells. She looked like a statue carved in storm clouds, impeccable, unmoved, unsmiling. The judge entered. Judge Deborah Whitlow, robes sharp, eyes sharper. "We're here to hear testimony in the matter of Hargrave Holdings v. Veronica Wells and Howard Vance on charges including corporate fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice." The clerk read it like it was just a grocery list, but every syllable hit like a drumbeat. Because this wasn't just a company cleaning house, this was war. Victoria stood, stepped to the center, and said in a voice that needed no microphone, "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Amani Reed." My name filled the room. I rose slowly, walked to the witness stand with every step practiced in my head 1,000 times the night before. The bailiff held out the Bible. I placed my hand over it. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The courtroom went still. Victoria approached with calm precision. "Amani, tell us how you came to be involved in this matter." I cleared my throat. "I was working nights with my mother. She's a janitor for Hargrave Tower. I had been assigned the 45th floor. That night, I heard the copier running and went to check. No one was there, but someone had left a thick file on the tray. It was titled, Final Authority Transfer. Did you read it? Yes. Why? My grandfather was a legal clerk. I grew up reading contracts instead of comic books. I saw language that didn't make sense, not for a standard delegation. And what did you find? A clause buried in the appendix. Section 7, Subsection C. It granted full, irrevocable decision-making power to Veronica Wells over Mr. Hargrave's personal and corporate trusts, without oversight, without time limits. A few jurors exchanged glances. Victoria pressed gently. "What did you do next?" "I warned him, the next day right before he signed it." "And how did the room respond?" "They tried to have me removed. I wasn't supposed to be there." "But Mr. Hargrave listened?" I turned my head slightly toward Charles, seated near the back. "He did." Victoria took a breath. "Amani, what would have happened if he had signed that document? He would have lost legal control over his entire company. She could have sold assets, merged holdings, even dissolved departments, and he wouldn't have had the legal power to stop her." Victoria let that settle in the room. A hush spread like fog. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attorney stood, older man, tailored suit, clipped beard, the kind of voice that sounded polite while pulling a knife. "Miss Reed, you're 20 years old, no formal legal training, never worked in a firm, never passed a bar exam." "No, sir." "And yet you claim to understand documents more complex than an entire team of corporate attorneys?" "I didn't understand everything," I said. "Just enough to know someone was hiding something." A flicker of movement in the jury box, someone nodding. He narrowed his eyes. "Is it possible you misunderstood?" "No, sir. I read it 5 times, then I read the others. All the other delegations filed under Mr. Hargrave's name in the last 18 months. Same structure, same loopholes, different shell companies." "You're saying you uncovered a years-long conspiracy from a copier?" I didn't blink. "Yes, because no one else did." He paused. For a moment, I think he realized I wasn't going to crack. The judge nodded. "You may step down." Next, Charles took the stand. Victoria approached slowly with a softness I hadn't expected. "Mr. Hargrave, why did you believe Amani?" He looked straight ahead, not at me. "Because I used to be the kind of man who read every line. Somewhere along the way, I stopped. I trusted my wife to handle the rest." His voice caught. "Amani reminded me what it looks like when someone actually pays attention." "And how did you feel when you realized the truth?" "Like I'd been asleep at the wheel of a ship I spent 40 years building." "What do you believe Veronica's role was?" "She planned it, with Vance. They built a system to take what I didn't think I'd ever have to guard." Then it was Veronica's turn. She walked to the stand with a grace that didn't falter, not even under oath. "Did you believe your actions were in the company's best interest?" her lawyer asked. "Yes," she said. "I was protecting the company, from indecision, from delay." Charles had grown tired. He admitted as much. "Did you forge his signature?" "I executed documents under authority we'd previously discussed." "Did you attempt to conceal transfers?" "I followed all disclosure protocols." Victoria stood. "Your Honor, permission to play audio from Exhibit 7A." "Granted." The courtroom echoed with her voice. "He won't question it, not if I push at the right time." Then Vance's reply. "And if he does?" Her answer, "We remind him what he has to lose." The playback ended. Silence throbbed. Victoria stepped forward. "Mrs. Wells, did you say those words?" Veronica stared straight ahead. "Yes." "Who were you referring to?" A pause. A breath. "My husband." "Why?" Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Because I didn't want to lose everything. I didn't trust him to hold it together, so I made sure I could." The judge banged her gavel once. "We'll break until closing arguments tomorrow." The room stirred to life, whispered press notes, shuffling feet. I stepped into the hallway, my legs finally remembering they had bones. Charles followed. "You didn't have to be here," he said. "I wanted to see it through," I replied. "You've already done more than most executives I know." I smiled faintly. Maybe titles are overrated. Behind us, Veronica sat at the defense table like a statue cracked at the base. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't just about legal battles or forged signatures. It was about who sees what others choose to ignore, and who finally says it out loud. The morning after the verdict, the city moved slower. It wasn't just the gray drizzle or the traffic lights that seemed to take their time blinking from red to green. It was something heavier, a silence beneath the noise. I stood on the steps of the courthouse beside my mother, coffee warming my palms, watching reporters sweep past in waves of questions and umbrellas. I'd thought I'd feel triumphant, victorious even. Instead, I just felt still, like my body hadn't caught up with everything my voice had done. Across the plaza, Charles Hargrave stepped out of a black car. He wasn't in a tailored suit or flanked by bodyguards. Just a long coat, open collar, and eyes that looked like he'd finally seen the foundation of his world and realized part of it had been rotting beneath his feet for years. He walked straight to me. "I need to talk to you," he said, no preamble. "Okay," I replied. We sat on a bench just beyond the courthouse's marble columns. Pigeons fluttered nearby, too used to people to care who was famous or disgraced. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. Handwritten. I recognized the seal before he spoke. The Hargrave Foundation was originally built to support business schools, scholarships, internships, things like that, he said. We want to relaunch it under a different philosophy, one that sees things most of us miss. He handed me the letter. My name was at the top. Below it, an offer, a full academic scholarship, funding for a mentorship program, and a job, if I wanted it, at Hargrave Holdings. I stared at it for a long moment. It felt surreal, like looking at a life that belonged to another version of me. "I don't want pity," I said finally. "You think this is pity?" he replied. "Imani, this company has a legal department that missed what you saw in a hallway, what you read at a kitchen table. You didn't just stop a fraud, you reminded me why this company was built." I folded the letter, tucked it into my coat, and nodded. "I'll think about it." That night, I walked home with my mother through Queens. The lights from the laundromat below our apartment buzzed neon pink and green in the rain. We climbed the narrow stairs, shoes squeaking with water, our shoulders brushing in the silence. Inside, she made collard greens and turkey necks. Not because it was a celebration, because it was a Tuesday. Because in our home, no matter what happened out there in the skyscrapers and courtrooms, dinner was still dinner, and tradition didn't wait for headlines. As we ate, she looked at me with something quiet in her expression. Not pride exactly, not relief, just something grounded, rooted. "You scared me," she said finally. "I scared myself." She didn't lecture me, she just passed the hot sauce. Later, I sat on the edge of my bed, flipping through digital files Victoria had sent me. Legal strategies, PR contingencies, a chart mapping how far Veronica's shadow had reached. Then a new message appeared from Gregory. "They know I'm alive, but they won't find me. Keep going, I'm still watching." I smiled, fingers flying across the keys. "We're winning." The next day, Victoria and I stood at the top of Hargrave Tower once again. This time, I wasn't carrying a mop bucket. I wasn't walking with my head down or a badge that said facilities. This time, I wore what I wanted: dark slacks, clean sneakers, and a look that said I knew exactly why I belonged in the room. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces. Executives, legal staff, a few who had turned a blind eye, a few who hadn't had a choice. And at the head of the table, Charles stood beside a new display screen. No agenda, no quarterly charts, just a photograph, 3 signatures, circled in red, one of them his. "Over the past 18 months," Victoria began, "a series of strategic delegations and forged authorizations were processed through this company. All of them pointed to the use of offshore entities and proxy firms controlled by Veronica Wells and Howard Vance." The room leaned in. This wasn't poor oversight, it was deliberate design, and it nearly succeeded. She clicked to the next slide. Wire transfers, legal filings, a direct line between Ravencross Holdings and internal control over Hargrave's legacy. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward, hands steady. "I wasn't supposed to find it," I said. "But when you clean the rooms no one pays attention to, you start to notice the dirt." A beat of silence. Then heads nodded. Not in mockery, in recognition. Charles looked around the room. "Some of you knew, some of you suspected, some of you said nothing." He paused. "But that ends today." He handed a thick envelope to the chairman of the compliance committee. Effective immediately, full internal audit, new oversight protocols, and a zero-tolerance policy for silence. As the room broke into quiet murmurs, I stepped back. My legs wanted to shake, but didn't. Charles turned to me. "You didn't have to come today?" "I did," I said softly. He nodded. "I see you now." I gave a faint smile. "I wasn't invisible," I said. "You just weren't looking." And somewhere across town, in a hotel suite that once felt untouchable, Veronica watched the news scroll across the screen. "Whistleblower reveals power grab at Hargrave Holdings." No photos of me, no interviews. Just a story she couldn't rewrite. Later that evening, back in our apartment, Mom handed me a warm mug of tea and sat beside me in the recliner. "You really think they'll change?" I stared out the window, the lights of the city blinking like a code I was just starting to understand. They already have, I said. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like someone waiting to be noticed. I felt like the one holding the light. Chat GPT Denoy. The next morning, the sky hung heavy over Manhattan, a dull steel canopy threatening rain but never quite committing. From across the street, I stared up at Hargrave Tower, its mirrored windows catching light that didn't feel like it belonged to this world anymore. My backpack was slung over one shoulder, weighted not with books, but with a flash drive and the kind of evidence that could turn concrete to ash. I stood still, listening to the hum of traffic and the whisper of shoes on pavement. Nobody looked at me. Nobody ever did. Until now. I crossed at the light. The new security team was already in place. Different uniforms, different posture. One of them, a broad-shouldered guy with a buzz cut and clipboard, stepped in front of me as I approached the main lobby doors. "You're not on the list," he said, curt but not rude. "I know," I said, pulling the flash drive from my coat pocket and holding it up like a badge. "But tell Mr. Hargrave I'm here." He said, if I ever came back, he'd want to see me. The guard narrowed his eyes, hesitating for just a second before lifting his radio. "She says Hargrave told her to come straight up. Name's Imani Reed." The static reply was short. "Then, send her up." I exhaled hard and fast, tried to look calm even though my heart was tapping Morse code against my ribs. The elevator dinged. A junior staffer I recognized from late-night coffee runs at the executive floor nodded once. "Come on," he said. I followed him in. The ride was smooth, silent, and oddly reverent, like an elevator to a chapel instead of a boardroom. No small talk, no music, just the hum of rising. At the 45th floor, the doors slid open. Sunlight poured through the tall windows like truth finding a crack in the lie. Charles Hargrave was waiting, not behind a desk, just standing there, hands in his pockets, jacket unbuttoned, shirt collar open like he'd come straight from war instead of bed. "Imani," he said. I nodded. "I brought something." We walked into the conference room together. Victoria Chang was already there, flipping through a legal binder the size of a city phone book. She looked up and gave me that small, solid nod, the kind that made me feel like I belonged in this room just as much as anyone. I handed Charles the flash drive. "It's from Gregory," I said, before he disappeared. Victoria inserted it into her laptop. The screen flickered, then bloomed with files, hundreds of them. Audio recordings, email threads, legal drafts. Subfolder after subfolder opened like locked drawers spilling secrets. At the center was one called Fallback Protocols. Raven Cross. Charles leaned in. One click and the truth poured out. Documents showing Clara Wells's signature on authorizations to liquidate company assets under Emergency Risk Protocol. A Cayman firm receiving tens of millions. A second approval, dated just 3 days before the board meeting, under Charles's name. Only it wasn't his signature. "They were going to gut us," Victoria said quietly, "from the inside." Charles exhaled like he'd taken a punch to the chest. Then he looked at me, not as the janitor's daughter, not as the girl who'd once been told to stay out of boardrooms, but as the reason he still had a company to fight for. "This isn't just fraud," Victoria added. "It's abuse of executive power. Clara and Vance didn't just try to take your company. They used it. Like a laundromat for whatever mess they made behind the scenes." I nodded. I figured, but I didn't know how deep it went. Victoria turned to Charles. "We need to move now. Federal injunctions, whistleblower protections, press coordination. If they think you're hesitating, they'll accelerate everything." Charles didn't answer right away. He looked at me instead. "Why did you come back, Imani?" I didn't hesitate. "Because I saw it. And once you see something like this, you can't unsee it." He nodded slowly. "You're braver than most men I've worked with." I gave him a tired smile. "I'm just not scared of dirt. I grew up cleaning it." Victoria pulled out a roadmap, legal motions, media steps, internal notices. The room transformed from conference space to war command. Then my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Stop now or it's your mother." My throat closed. Hands trembling, I showed Victoria the screen. She read it, then snapped into motion. "I'm calling in protective detail. They touch her, we press federal charges." Charles was already moving. "Where is she now?" "She's at the laundromat, working the morning shift," I said. "She doesn't answer when she's folding." I'm coming with you, Charles said. You don't have to. I'm not letting them touch you, or her. 30 minutes later, we burst through the back of the laundromat. Mom was there, folding a stack of towels like nothing in the world was wrong. Mom, I ran to her, already crying. She blinked, startled. I'm fine, Imani. What's going on? Charles stepped in behind me, his presence sudden and vast. You're safe, he said. I promise. Mom looked between us, then at me. This has gone too far. I choked out, I didn't start it, but I'm going to finish it. That night, somewhere in a high-rise suite, Clara Wells watched the news footage, rumors of internal audits, frozen assets, and whistleblowers. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Vance sat across from her, swirling ice in his glass, the sound cold and quiet. He's not backing down, he muttered. Clara's eyes were darker than before. Neither is the girl. Vance raised an eyebrow. Then maybe it's time we remind them what silence costs. Back in our apartment, Mom and I sat together on the couch. A fresh bruise of fear sat under my ribs, but my eyes were wide open. The TV buzzed in the background, but I wasn't watching. I was reviewing files, cross-referencing metadata, tracking what Victoria sent after the call with the Justice Department. One thread stood out. Subject, strategic silence, from Clara's private server to Howard Vance. He's beginning to waver. If he pulls out, the fallback account must be activated. Don't let the girl show up in the news. I don't care what it takes. I read it twice. Then again, my mother peeked in, holding a mug of warm milk. You've been at it for hours. I'm close, I said. To what? To showing the world who's really pulling the strings. She walked in, set the mug beside me, and brushed a curl behind my ear. I'm proud of you, she said. Even if it puts us both at risk. Especially then, I asked, barely whispering. Especially then. Somewhere across town, Clara picked up her phone and muttered into the receiver. He moved. He brought the lawyer. Vance's voice came back cold. Then we adjust the timeline. We're not losing this. No, he replied. We're just getting started. But so was I. I grabbed my Sharpie, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote 3 words across the top page. They blinked first, and I knew, whatever happened next, I wasn't walking into silence. I was becoming the sound. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. Imani's journey wasn't just about contracts or corporations. It was about the courage to speak when silence feels safer and the power of doing what's right even when no one's looking. In a world where truth often hides in the margins and power moves in silence, this story reminds us that integrity doesn't wear a title and bravery doesn't need permission. Sometimes the most overlooked voices carry the weight of change. If this story moved you, even a little, tell us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city and state in the comments. We'd love to know how far this story has reached. And if you believe in more stories like this, stories that shine light into hidden corners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Because the next voice that changes everything might be yours.